intro. Welcome to another edition of the Old School Shooters here on Canada's top combat sports podcast, the Hannibal TV. It is the pernicious purveyor of preposterous pomposity and paragon of pugilistic punditry, the King of Connecticut. Doing the introduction this time, we usually hear from Gentleman Jack Kilby, the no gimmicks guy, but this is going to be the first episode that I'll be doing with a gentleman who I've had the pleasure of being a guest on his show, MMA Power Hour, a number of times, Mr. Colin Crandall. He always has upcoming UFC fighters that are fighting that weekend. And he's had a long-standing show on Fight TV and here on the Hannibal TV. And in this incarnation of Old School Shooters, we have a very special guest, a man that is the hardest working man in the podcast universe, it seems. John Paz. John, how are you?
Doing great. Thank you guys for having me on. Appreciate it. Thanks for the intro.
No problem.
Thank you, John. You know, I've admired your work in the past, watched you interview Kevin Sullivan and Tom Pritchard and other folks. I had the pleasure myself of being a guest on another incarnation of Kevin Sullivan's show last year with Andrew Anderson and Matty Rock. But you do some outstanding clips and interviews with the Taskmaster.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And I was struck by your interview with Mark Raymundi, and you seem to have a vast knowledge of combat sports and mixed martial arts.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, long-time fan for sure. It's fun to kind of more talk about some of the old school MMA stuff and kind of go that route. But, you know, I obviously keep up with modern stuff as well.
Yeah, that's what we've done here with Old School Shooters. I came up with the idea for this show, having been a character on Hannibal TV for some years. And my relationship with Hannibal began actually in booking some MMA fighters that I had trained with and managed onto the Hannibal TV for Hannibal to interview, and he did outstanding long-form interviews with those guys. And I saw you interviewed Josh Barnett too with Rick Bassman a while back.
Yeah, oh yeah. That was fun. Josh is great. I love him because not only is he, you know, an MMA fighter, but he loves pro wrestling too. So it's fun to kind of shoot the shit with him and kind of go back and forth on that too.
Yeah, I'm currently a business development manager and broadcaster for Shoot Pro Wrestling that Jake Shannon runs. And he's been doing work with Josh for decades as far as coaching clinics. But Jake's another guy who crosses genres. He used to do a lot of the clinics with Billy Robinson years ago. And the Shoot Pro Wrestling is an interesting promotion. We're actually bringing it to Great North Wrestling, bringing a 4-man tournament. We have low to mid-card UFC fighters, grapplers from promotions like High Rollers, and collegiate wrestlers competing in as the term says, Shoot Pro Wrestling, and they've actually did a all tag team show as well. So it's pretty wild, pretty interesting. Colin, I want to bring you in here and introduce yourself to Mr. Paz.
Absolutely, Mr. Paz. John, Colin Crandall here from MMA Power Hour. Always appreciate working with the King of Connecticut, my good friend for about 6 years, Matthew Granahan. One correction I can make, Matthew, is we really are not the show that just has up-and-coming UFC fighters. We have top 10, top 5, and championship UFC fighters, having interviewed a majority of them. I'm credentialed media with the UFC and all other major sanctioning bodies, PFL, Bellator, One Championship. And we do occasionally have an up-and-coming fighter, but majority of the time, everyone we have on our show is top 20, top 10, top 5, or a current or past world champion in the UFC or in the UFC Hall of Fame. We did our show as a podcast on Fight TV for a few years, and then switched to the much better Hannibal TV on YouTube with 400,000 nearly subscribers. We've recently switched for kind of a test for a few months doing Twitter Spaces, and we're starting to really get some traction there. We're going to go back to our video format at some point because we know that has value, although I know people like looking at gorgeous female supermodels a lot more than me, so I know it's not a huge amount of value that I add for video, but we like doing it. People are visual anyway. So we're big into MMA. I had a copy of the press kit for UFC #1 before the event, and had already watched the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in Action VHS tapes for about a year and a half. So I was one of a handful of people. While not officially training with them in their garage, I was learning a little bit from a friend who was, and I was very familiar with what was going to happen, and been a big fan of the UFC ever since. And also growing up as a Generation X guy, big professional wrestling fan for many, many years, the 80s, the 90s, when I watched it mostly. And just happy to be here and talk to you and talk to the King of Connecticut as always.
Awesome. So John, how did you start your journey in pro wrestling and combat sports journalism?
Really? I mean, it was probably about 8 years ago or so. Even before that, maybe 10 years ago or so, was just writing a sports blog, something small, something, nothing much. And then a few years later, about 2015, started a podcast. And it wasn't that many podcasts out there that was doing interviews with wrestlers, MMA fighters, and guys like that. So I figured, nowadays, fast forward 8 years now, everyone does it and kind of does the same, a very similar thing where they're doing that. But 8 years ago, wasn't really that many podcasts doing it. I felt like that was definitely a market that needed to be out there and be cool to tell all these guys' stories, and really guys that I was a fan of, guys that I grew up idolizing, could be even current guys that I liked, or guys that were, maybe future wrestling stars or future MMA stars. So it's one of those things where I just was like, man, I love this stuff. It would be awesome to talk to these guys that not only I was a fan of, but guys that I, enjoy watching, or guys that really accomplished something either in MMA or pro wrestling. And it kind of just took off from there. And 8 years later, still doing it.
Awesome. Who's been your favorite guest over the years?
Got to say I'm a big Hogan guy, so I got to say probably Hulk Hogan is probably the number one. I know you know him, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. I loved having him on. Sting was great. You know what? A weird one that I loved just because it was so random. Bob Sapp was a lot of fun, just because he's so nutty. So there's so many guys. Sting was cool. There's so many awesome guys that I've been able to, luckily have on over the last 8 years. Yeah,
I have a funny story about Bob Sapp, and actually involves the Hannibal. The Hannibal years ago had Sid Vicious on, and I know Bob, and Bob wanted to do a sort of a shoot style pro wrestling or MMA fight with Big Sid, and I tried to coordinate that with those two guys, and I was on some calls with them, and never materialized, but it was entertaining, man. People don't realize in Asia, Bob Sapp is a huge, huge television star. Not just outside of MMA and pro wrestling, huge star.
Oh, man, yeah, he did everything. Pro wrestling, I think he do a little bit of sumo, obviously did MMA, did kickboxing, did boxing, did all their TV shows, did commercials, did those goofy game shows. He did everything over there. Oh, yeah, they loved him because they loved the bigger guys, over so there. So charismatic, yeah. Definitely, man. And yeah, he started a number of commercials, and he had that look. It was that dichotomy between him and the smaller Asian ladies. Colin, who's been your favorite guest that you've had on, besides me, of course?
Of course. Well, you have to be number one, of course. The late Stephen Bonner, God bless him. I enjoyed having him on 2 or 3 times. Like he said to me when people were asking about crypto, and he said they are real. I know because I have some. So that was a great sentence, letting people know that crypto was real. Man, so many great people I've had on my show. Who I love having? My friend, the legendary Cutman, Stitch Duran, is one of my favorite guests. I've spoken with him, I think, on about a dozen occasions over the last 6 years, and he doesn't do a lot of interviews, and he is an amazing guy. I've also really enjoyed speaking to Art Davie, the creator of the UFC, with Jorge and Gracie a couple times. I really enjoyed also talking to Burt Watson. He was a part of the UFC and is a part of Bellator now, and is a really, really amazing guy. Had a kind of a thing go semi-viral a couple of weeks ago where he was giving a pep talk to his fighters. Just so many. John Peretti, one of the OGs of the UFC and MMA years ago, and just so many of the fighters, man, and coaches, and man, just. I was going to ask, should I ask a question to John? Because I'd like to get John's opinion on a couple of things also. Is that all right, Matthew? So
yeah,
John,
sure, brother.
Appreciate it. So, John, what do you think from watching MMA over all these years? I know there's been some wrestling involvement, and I know we had Brock Lesnar jump on over and do well. Bobby Lashley jumped in for a little while, did very well, and I think he may still be open to MMA fights. CM Punk didn't do as well, but I think Batista may have had a fight. And then we had a couple of things where Brock Lesnar went up against Daniel Puder in that Tough Enough thing or whatever it was. And then also I think there was another time where they did, or maybe the Tough Enough was when they actually did MMA fights for that one thing in wrestling. Can you remind us of what that was? I think I'd like to get your thoughts on that one, where that they actually had the guys do like MMA, they really fought each other, and then the guy they hoped to win didn't win, and then they threw him to the dogs against Butterbean. What was that called, and who were the guys involved in that?
Oh, that was the Brawl for All,
yes.
WWF 1998, during the hottest period, really, in wrestling, during the Attitude Era. For some reason, they came up with an idea, kind of Vince Russo, who's the head writer, kind of his idea that let's put these guys out there. And he says, he pitched 100 ideas to them, and Vince liked that one. Obviously, Vince McMahon, the owner and the boss, makes the final decision, but he liked the idea. It was basically boxing gloves, but kind of MMA rules. So you could do takedowns, but there was no ground and pound. You couldn't do any of that, so they'd stand you back up, but the takedowns counted, towards the final score if they went to the judges. When you looked at it, though, if you're a wrestler and you have boxing gloves on and you're taking guys down, I mean, it was just poorly conceived and a really, really piss poor decision on their part, because there were so many injuries for it too. Like JBL, John Bradshaw Layfield, was a part of it. You had Road Warrior Hawk, Draws, Dr. Death Steve Williams, who got severely hurt, really tore up his knee really bad in that one. There's a story out there that maybe Jim Ross really wanted Dr. Death Steve Williams to win that, and obviously the guy that ended up winning the whole thing was Bart Gunn, and Bart Gunn ended up knocking out Steve Williams. He beat Godfather, who's just a huge man that did some training and some boxing training himself. He knocked out JBL. I mean, Bart Gunn was a bad dude, but then he went up against Butterbean, and it was strange. It was at WrestleMania 15. I was there. He kind of tried to fight him in a different style than he fought everybody else. When he fought everybody else in the tournament, he was just like, it's like he didn't even care. It was just like swinging for the fences, almost like Fedor. It's like just some swinging, really wild punches. And when he fought Butterbean, for some reason, he was like really calm. He was trying to be like very technical. Butterbean picked him apart and knocked him down once, and then knocked him out the second time in the first round. But it ended up being Bart Gunn. He didn't really have too much success in the WWF after that. Actually, for winning it, for some reason, almost got punished and ended up getting released about a year later, but did have a lot of success in Japan. It's just interesting. That was really like a mistake because there were so many injuries of the wrestlers. But why, if you're wrestlers, do you want to see who's the toughest guy? When you're booking it, it's too unpredictable. You just don't know who's going to win.
Right.
I actually love the idea. I love watching it because, Colin, Eric Paulson. You've had Eric on your show, and when I trained at CSW, Eric used to do that. It's called shoot boxing. Eric said he created it. When you buy and when I trained fighters, that was one of the things I trained wrestlers on was shoot boxing, parrying punches and get inside and getting takedowns. I thought it was really cool, man. And Dan, my good buddy Dan Severn, that was a slobber knocker he had with the Godfather, and it was actually close. That would have been an embarrassment if Godfather had dropped him with one of those haymakers. But I loved the Brawl for All, and the guy that I think could have won it was Steve Blackman, and Steve Blackman dominated Mark Merrow in that Brawl for All with takedowns. If you want to see a takedown clinic, how to parry punches and fight boxing defensively and shooting takedowns. Watch Steve Blackman. And I go back years ago to Virginia, 2007. Steve Blackman used to have a school in Pennsylvania, and he'd have a lot of fighters at the small shows, at the local shows. And I met him. I met Steve a couple of times, outside of the professional wrestling world, and he's a bad dude. I think to John's point, to Paz's point, he's absolutely right. The mistake that was made in the finals by Bart Gunn is he got himself a boxing trainer. And instead of going out there and brawling, turning it into a Pier Sixer and brawling and tying Butterbean up, Butterbean's got those short arms. You want to get on the inside of him and tie him up. And if you got some wrestling, you can hit him with trips, and get those takedowns. He didn't try to go for any takedowns in that. He tried to go straight boxing. But I love the concept. I thought it was pretty cool.
I think, though, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim Cornette is still angry about that, isn't he, Paz?
Yeah, because so many injuries happened. A lot of the guys got hurt, so they obviously didn't plan for that. You never plan for injuries, but when the guys get hurt, it's just one of those things where it's like, why did we do this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you look back and maybe a little Monday morning quarterbacking too. It's like, why did we end up doing this? All these guys are going to get hurt. But booking-wise, it could hurt some of the guys. Like, let's say Merrill was going to get some sort of push. Well, he got de-pushed. Like they were saying, Dr. Death Steve Williams was going to get this big push. Legit tough guy. And he got knocked out. Then he doesn't get the push. Obviously, he was out of his prime at that point. Years earlier in Japan, there's stories of him, beating up 8 cops at once. So, it is what it is. But injuries sucked. I mean, that just killed the tournament.
Yeah, let me give you guys an interesting stat on Dr. Death Steve Williams that most fans probably don't know. He wrestled Dan Severn in college one time, and this was wasn't always a heavyweight. He had a really tough heavyweight division there with Baumgartner and Bannock and Dr. Death Steve Williams. But Dr. Death pinned Dan Severn in under 30 seconds.
Wow.
He steamrolled him and pancaked him. So a lot of people don't realize what a bad dude Steve Williams was in college. He played football as well, so he wasn't completely dedicated to wrestling, and he joined wrestling into the season, and he was outpointed in the finals by one of the greatest, Bruce Baumgartner, considered to be one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. I think he lost by 1 or 2 points. So pro wrestling fans don't realize what a bad dude Dr. Death was, but not a striker, maybe a bar brawler, but not a striker, not a boxer.
Yeah, and I heard that, and I don't know if this is true, but I've heard through the grapevine, he wanted the fingers in the gloves. Like he wanted to be able to, use his hands, like grip. And they said, no, boxing gloves only. So
did Dan.
Didn't like the rules.
Yeah, that's why Dan left the tournament after the first match. And Dan told the story to me. I interviewed Dan down at Berman Law Group Studios. Had him in our studio last year, and he told the story that he was taking a nap in the back when they called him in last minute to be part of that, because he and Ken Shamrock weren't supposed to be part of it.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, so crazy trivia, guys.
The only thing that was good about it for those guys was they got a little bump in pay for doing it. That was the only bonus of it.
Yeah, I thought it was exciting, though, right? I mean, the way they did it, and they dimmed the lights. But imagine this, and this is what we're trying to promote now, Shoot Pro Wrestling. Imagine bringing in a 4-man Shoot Pro Wrestling tournament and maybe picking one of the guys from the roster, because, God, we had Jerry Briscoe on recently on Old School Shooters, and Jerry recruited a guy that I had coached, Tim Dudley, that went on to wrestle for Nebraska. He also recruited another guy that went on to play football for Clemson that I coached. And I had a couple guys go down there through Jerry. And all Jerry did was recruit amateur wrestlers. So there's some really good shooters in WWE. Imagine if we had a 4-man Shoot Pro Wrestling tournament on a WWE card or an AEW card. We're going to do it on Great North Wrestling. I think it would be really cool, man. Something different for the fans,
I'd love to see that. John.
Yeah.
How about you, John?
For sure. Have you seen Bloodsport? The Josh Barnett kind of like promotion that he does.
Yeah, I booked Baroni for that. Phil did that at one point when he was staying at Freeman's house. So yeah, I'm pretty well acquainted with the concept. That's unique, but the difference is Bloodsport is a work. This is true pro wrestling is 100% shoot.
Oh, okay.
And John, we can show you some of the matches we've done because all the guys we've booked are from UFC, Bellator, High Rollers. Or straight off the collegiate wrestling mat because it's pin and submit rules. So it's the old catch wrestling rules. We just had Corinne Jacobs, Michigan State Spartans captain from wrestling that won one of the big catch wrestling tournaments that Jake had put on. So Jake is trying to do it more. Now we're going to add some sizzle. There's going to be a lot of sizzle and storylines outside the ring. There's been 3 shows already. This next show at Great North Wrestling is going to be the first time that we bring it to a pro wrestling promotion, with the 4-man tournament structure. But there's been 3 shows already and then a 4th tag team show. So I can show you the shows that we've done already. It's pretty cool, and I'm loving being a broadcaster for it, booking it. It's something cool, and we're excited to bring it to the Hannibal TV, and to Great North Wrestling. Yeah, but I'm very familiar with the Bloodsport. Dan went against Frank Mir in that as well, and that's a cool concept as well. But that's kind of in between because that's kind of like a UWFI.
Yeah,
in it being a work, whereas this is a full shoot with a lot of current, studs. And I want to say, one of my best friends that Colin mentioned earlier that passed Christmas Eve, Stephen Bonner, I produced a commercial for Shoot Pro Wrestling with him and Forrest Griffin, and we had big plans for Bonner. Bonner was going to be, Bonner and I have broadcasted together in MMA. Some of those fights are here on the Hannibal TV. People can watch those fights that I've given to Hannibal from South Carolina, from Myrtle Beach, and from Spartanburg. But Bonner was supposed to be my broadcast partner, and we had some creative plan with Bonner. So, I don't want to well up and start crying through my glasses here, but R.I.P. to my man, the American Psycho.
He and I shared the same birthday of April 4th. I was a little bit older than him, but yeah. So our birthdays are next week. He would have.
Well, happy birthday, Crandall. Happy birthday,
thank you, Colin. Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Getting older, but like fine wine, aging in some ways, except for my joints and aching back and neck and shoulder, which is not aging like fine wine, but the rest of it, yeah. It's amazing how wrestlers can keep going. Speaking of that really quick, John, never ceases to amaze me how these guys can be 40, 45, 50, 55, and even 60 in there. It's incredible how that goes on like that, and these guys are just that tough, and it's amazing. Is that something that surprises you, or you probably started to be aware that they're gonna keep pushing it? And what are some of the ages of some of the older celebrities in wrestling that we've heard of?
Well, sometimes I feel like as far as them being like older, sometimes, the matches aren't that good, or they need to be protected a little bit, or, maybe they shouldn't be taking as many bumps. But it is what it is because they still draw and they still bring a crowd and people are still interested in them. They're still mainstream. So a lot of those guys do need to be brought back because a lot of the current guys aren't as popular as the older guys. So I still like it and I enjoy it. And the nostalgia factor always, gets a pop from me. I always love that stuff. But if you look at guys like John Cena, who they're bringing back, he's 45 years old. He's kind of getting up there. He hasn't taken too many bumps in the last few years, but he's old. Let's say The Rock comes back, which is a big rumor out there. He's going to be 51. Steve Austin wrestled last year and looked awesome, doing a brawl over the place. He's 57. Sting still wrestles, and he's in awesome shape. I mean, he's kind of a freak of nature, though. He's kind of an outlier, but he's 64. Ric Flair wrestled last year at 73. Yep. So, I mean, you can't get up there and wrestle, but I think that sometimes you need to be protected or do something else as far as when you're working the match, like Austin, maybe do more brawls, don't take as many bumps, or you take the one big bump or the two big bumps, and maybe the guy you're working with is younger and he kind of takes a lot of the bumps. But it's amazing, some of these guys, even some of the Japanese guys like Minoru Suzuki, who's a great shoot fighter, Sakuraba, who might be the best pro wrestler, MMA fighter ever, if you kind of look at if you're combining the worlds there.
Legend.
He still wrestles too, and he's he's getting up there in age. It's amazing some of these guys are
You know,
still doing it.
I got a quick story before we close this out. I want to close it out. So speaking of Kazushi Sakuraba and Stefan Bonner, and this shows to how smooth Bonner was, man. When I booked him for his first pro wrestling match at House of Glory in New York City, I was calling the action, and it was supposed to be against Matt Riddle. And I've told the story a few times, but I'll tell it really quick for pause. Bonner told me when we were sharing a room together in Queens, and he goes, Riddle's not going to show up. And I said, what are you talking about, man? He was looking, he's got nothing on his social media. He's like, I was the man from Ultimate Fighter. You know, it was Bonner and Griffin. He goes, this guy was, you know, third-tier guy on Ultimate Fighter. Why isn't he promoting this match with me? Well, he was right, because we had a call literally 3 hours before the show from the promoter that Riddle had pulled out, and he was replaced by Sho Tanaka, who had just done a show in Japan, or done a series in Japan. He was married to, as they say in pro wrestling, with Kazushi Sakuraba. So Sho didn't speak a word of English, and I called that match, and man, they spoke in the language of wrestling, and it was fantastic, man. And speaking of old timers getting in the ring, I've announced it on the Hannibal TV. Spiro Papakosmos, the greatest wrestler in the history of Norwalk High School, has called me out. He was in the stands in 2017 when I headlined the fundraiser for our wrestling team for the new mats, and he got a new heart, and he's coach now with the Norwalk Bears in Connecticut. And I'm coming back, bringing my tag team partner, that is Kenny Lester, former ASU heavyweight wrestler from just before Cain Velasquez, and we're taking on Spiro and Platon Kokidis, one of the greatest Greek wrestlers, one of the greatest wrestlers in the history of Norwalk High as well. And I guarantee you, fans, if you want to see what it says on the marquee, wrestling, these aren't pro wrestlers, they're nasty beast amateur wrestlers, and we're going to come up there and we're gonna tear the place down like we did in 2017. That's coming up this fall at Norwalk High in Connecticut. And I want to thank the Paz, John Paz, for coming on the show. And before we close out, and before I hit you with a little song, where can folks follow you? I'm sure a lot of folks listening are already fans and watch it here on Hannibal TV.
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at 2Man Power Trip. Check out the website, tmptempire.com. Everything will be on my socials there on Twitter and Instagram, where you can find the latest episodes and see what else is going on in the world. Just had on Diamond Dallas Page, who's a pretty damn good, or was, pretty damn good professional wrestler. Yeah. Speaking of that, he's going to be 67. I think he could still go if he wanted to.
I believe it.
He's in great shape. I want to give a shout out to DDP, because when I got Phil Baroni and Kamal Shalarus before Bonner came into pro wrestling, when I got them into pro wrestling, he got us involved with the DDP yoga, and he used to do blast outs on his Twitter for their wrestling appearances. Great guy. We had him on my old show, King's Court, years ago, that I did with Brian Snow. I know Colin remembers that. Now, Colin, I'm going to throw it to you. Where can folks follow the Cranimal?
I'll tell you really quick, though. Here's the line, what you can use, that you should use. Sorry, I can't talk here. For your fight, you're going to say you're going to send Big Papa Spiro to the cosmos in that match. That's what I will say. You may use that. Yeah. MMA,
I call him Spyro the Gyro.
Spyro Gyro, man. That was a group. Yeah, MMA Power Hour. We're pretty much most active on Twitter now. Twitter Spaces every Tuesday night. You can follow me at Colin Crandall 33. Which is Colin Crandall MMA. I have never understood why they had two names. You have your @ which is your handle, and then your other thing, whatever the hell the reason is. But at Colin Crandall 33, Colin Crandall MMA, MMA Power Hour every Tuesday night. It's interactive, so if you jump into the Twitter space, you will be able to ask questions of the fighter guests. But don't forget, you got to jump in there, because the recording stays there. So if you're looking at it 2 hours, 5 hours the next day after, you're not going to be able to talk to anyone. You got to jump in Tuesday between 6 and 8 p.m. Pacific time, MMA Power Hour. And John, I've noticed your interviews on the Hannibal TV big fan. I really like the work that you do.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome, guys. So I do want to say one quick shout out because there is another John Paz out there. There's John Paz, our guest, and I had the honor and privilege of coaching up in Fort Mill, South Carolina for C2X Wrestling Academy, run by Tom Tannis, for All-American from Rutgers. My buddy Mike Dietor, stud wrestler from back home in Connecticut, is coaching there with Chris Weidman, who many folks will know. Chris lives in his area there in South Carolina. And there's another John Paz that was actually coached by Tom Tannis that is a current All-American, recent graduate of Rutgers University. So John Paz is a great name in wrestling. And I want to close out in song, of course, the tagline from the chairman of the board that we always close out Old School Shooters. Here we go. I've been to town, beyond the boulevard and down the beach, and I've learned things that only time can teach. Thank you to John Paz and Colin Crandall, Old School Shooters, Silver Sages, spreading knowledge to the younger ages. Until we meet again, gentlemen.